but just if you don't mind leaving the window open for just a few minutes, it completes uploading to the server. Perfect. So could you just please state your name and the title that I could use for you?
My name's Lyn. I'm a community organizer at the CACV. It's the Comité d'Action des Citoyens et Citoyennes de Verdun.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Did the name change? Was it Comité d'Action de contre Verdun contre la gentrification? Sorry, I'm all these groups in my head.
So the CACV has existed since, I believe, the 70s. That's our actual housing committee in Verdun. Like a lot of neighborhoods in Montreal have their own housing committee. Ours is the CACV. Verdun Ensemble contre la gentrification was, or is, like a neighborhood grassroots organization that me and some neighbors started way back. And now it's kind of like become part of the CACV, like our mobilization committee. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Kind of like merged, I guess, in a way, or
Yeah.
become something greater.
It, well, I think like with the rapid gentrification in the neighborhood, it was just a matter of time before these things merged, before our housing committee, like obviously we have to be more proactive, given the circumstances. So for sure, it was kind of inevitable, I think, that these two merged.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. So I'm sure there's a lot you could discuss, but I guess kind of the main points. How is gentrification affecting Verdun and continuing to affect Verdun?
Yeah, well, I live and work in Verdun, and I see my neighbors and the tenants that I work with like intensely rent evicted and well evicted in all different ways. The tactics that are used are way more aggressive. Like it's always been bad since like the beginning of the housing crisis, but now we see. I mean, it's always been vulnerable people that have been super prone to, like eviction and the symptoms of gentrification. But now it's families, elders, students, people living alone, everyone, even up to like middle class families. So it's really intense, and the evictions are out of control, and the tactics are just more and more fierce. Really, that affects people in all aspects of their lives. I mean, when you're like forced out of a community, especially if you've lived here, for decades, you lose your services, your community, you lose everything.
When you say it's out of control, what kind of maybe specific examples or circumstance would you attribute to that?
Sorry, I think we cut out a bit.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. When you say out of control, are there maybe specific examples that might come to mind when you think of this?
There are so many, like in terms of, there's like legal ways to get people out of their apartments, like doing major renovation, which we all know like equals renoviction. Like there's other ways too, like just harassing tenants to the point where the like psychological stressors don't make it worth it to stay and fight, even if people don't have anywhere else to go. So I can't think of a specific example because it's such a there are just so many of them. We receive calls where the viciousness of like the tactics used are like mind blowing, and they're often very much backed up by the towel. It makes it really hard to defend yourself because a lot of the times they're not breaking the law, but yeah, proving harassment is also not always very easy.
The towel
Um,
is. Oh, so sorry.
no,
Please continue. Continue.
no, I was, uh, I was just trying to think, I guess, of a more specific example, but they just all bleed into each other. There are so many, like, yeah.
Thank you. I wanted to bring up the towel, especially now that you mention it, but you know, kind of seen as that resource for tenants. How helpful are they actually, in situations of rent evictions or just any threat really to someone having a roof over their head?
Well, I think over the last few years, we've definitely learned that the TAL is not this like ultimate protection for tenants. And that's why we're seeing like tenants deal with things in different ways. Like we're seeing tenant unions in Montreal, pop up because like the TAL has failed tenants. There, there are so many loopholes. There are so many conflict of interest with judges. There are so many issues. I mean, we could talk about this for it's incredible. Like it really is. The towel I think ultimately fails tenants. Preparing for a lot of these cases is not realistic for your everyday person. There's so many cases open. The agents at the towel seem really overwhelmed, not super able to help people. They often refer tenants to housing committees who, we're not lawyers. We provide housing information. Um, yeah, no, I see it as a big mess.
When you mention conflict of interest, would that be some of the judges being landlords themselves?
Landlords themselves or have relationships with property owners. I mean, just like in government, we see these conflicts of interest. They're undeniable for sure. To me, I think, like when a ship is sinking, normally you would think, like you act, right? But maybe they're not acting because they're like kind of already on a yacht, safe. So that's how I see like the CAC and even like layers of municipal government, and agent the TAL ultimately too. Yeah, like why should they act? Why should they make changes that benefit tenants?
That's a great metaphor, a very sad one, but a very appropriate one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so when I was doing some research into the situation in Verdun, I was reading that on Wellington Lyn Street, it's experienced high amounts of gentrification, both in commercial and residential spaces. And I'm kind of curious because something I'm looking into is, local stores, independent stores being pushed out to kind of make room for chains. Have you noticed this in, Wellington, Longlease, or Verdun in general, where high amounts of luxury restaurants or stores are kind of moving in and replacing locally independently owned places?
Yes, it's been a long time coming. Like the Promenade Wellington, especially after being voted like the coolest street in the world or whatever. We see smaller chains moving in. Like, I mean, like most gentrified neighborhoods, we see like fancy coffee shops and blah blah blah. We've seen so many local stores close down. There's not a lot of protection for commercial spaces in terms of like leasing. So yeah, but the Promenade Wellington itself, I believe, I'm not 100% sure on this, but I believe that there is some rules about like not including big chains on the street. Like we have a bulk barn, but aside from that, it's you won't see like Starbucks, stuff like this, but you will see like coffee chains, like, you know, they'll have one in like St. Henry, and then they'll have one in NDG, and then all of a sudden one is popping up in Verdun. We see a lot of that for sure. Yeah.
And would you say that this is kind of a threat to, I guess, the identity of the community?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a lot of things that contribute to gentrification, and that's definitely one of them. Because what happens is, I mean, it's not just identity, it's access, right? It's like when we want to go on Wellington and go shopping, food becomes less and less affordable. The stores are not geared towards the original residents or just your average person, really. Like, yeah.
And as a result, are you finding that more residents in Verdun who have lived in the area for quite a while are having to take longer trips to be able to afford groceries or other essential needs?
Yeah, well, we still have some spots that are here where you can find affordable produce, but I do think it's becoming more rare and rare. And I definitely know that more and more people use food banks. That's for sure.
Thank you. And then maybe I don't know if there's anything to add to this, but outside of rent and things like groceries, have you seen other prices kind of increase too? I know that inflation in general and things like that are impacting everywhere, but maybe that you've seen over the last couple years or so that you might notice as unique to Verdun.
Besides rent and prices of food, honestly, not that I can think of. Just it is everything though. Like, yeah.
Thank you. What can we do to stop gentrification in Verdun, but also overall in Montreal?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, well, to actually have impact on stopping the housing crisis, especially in this stage, there has to be action on all levels of government. That starts with on the municipal level for bylaws, strong and immediate bylaws. On the provincial, I mean, it's obvious cutting funding or just abolishing Accès Logis was like putting community organizations under a guillotine. Like that had such a huge impact. We can't if we're not even going to fund our community organizations. Like I don't know where we're going. We need a rent registry. The CAC won't do it. This is not surprising. The municipal government is talking about doing it. But it's, in my opinion, insufficient. I don't think it even covers like 35% of the rental market. But not only that, they want to implement it over 5 years, which is not appropriate. We see how fast this crisis happens and how it continues to grow. Doing this over 5 years is unacceptable. They want to start with 100 units, I think, and then gradually go down to 8. Even if we reached 8, that's not sufficient. Here in Verdun alone, most of our buildings are sixplexes, even under. So yeah, there's a lot that they could do. There's a lot. And I don't expect much from the CAC. I don't think anyone working in community expects much from them, but I would hope that on a municipal level we could at least see some kind of teeth, but we don't.
What exactly does holding either our municipal or provincial governments accountable look like outside of going to the polls? Maybe more rapid pressure.
Yeah, outside of going to the polls, I mean, I guess ways to act like as a citizen, as a tenant, would be joining your local housing committees, supporting the people, the organizations, the Reclac, the Frappru, who have already had these revendications for a long time. We've been clearly stating what needs to happen. So we need people on the ground for sure. This is not easy when you're like a working class tenant who has a lot of really important stuff to do. You're just surviving, right? But it's clear the government doesn't listen to us. So yeah, it's going to require a lot of mobilization, and we try to do that in Verdun for sure. But like I said, it's not easy. People are already struggling. Like, who has time to become a community organizer? You know, it's not it's not easy. But we definitely have to continue to put pressure, to put more pressure, and to be vocal about the lack of like aggressive action, because we know that it has to be aggressive. This is already happening, you know. The idea of incremental change, this is not the solution. This is a cop out.
When you say the idea of incremental change, is there a specific example that comes to mind, and maybe in terms of provincial or municipal government?
Incremental change, I think Projet Montréal is really big on that, as are a lot of like more liberal parties, and the idea of not doing anything radical and not like shaking things up too much. The idea of diplomacy, the idea of always having to watch what you say when it comes to talking about a party, because maybe they're giving the bare minimum type thing. Like, I think that Projet Montréal in general is a good example of incremental change. The housing registry that they're talking about is a good example of incremental change that would fail to address a crisis that is so strong and so rapidly moving. You know, we need something to counter that. We need something that is strong to counter that. And right now, not tomorrow. We needed this yesterday, you know? And the CAC with incremental change, I mean, I don't think that they even fall under that umbrella. I think it's the opposite. Like, we are going backwards. So I can't, I don't think they fit in that.
If that makes sense, thank you.
Yeah.
And I guess, are there any maybe successful wins for Dunn recently, such as, you know, securing social housing in the area, or just any kind of examples of to show that, you know, fighting gentrification, it's, although it's a lot of difficult times to just kind of, I don't know how to quite verbalize this, but to just show that there maybe has been some wins, if any. Okay.
Recently, no, I don't feel like we have a lot of wins. I feel like what we're up against is so like invasive, and tenants need to see a win somewhere. I see a win in terms of, you know, making progress against gentrification as like tenants coming together. So when I see people organizing their building, or, you know, coming to our housing committee with their neighbors, or like they're in contact with their neighbors and they're all on the same page and they're getting to know their neighbors, to me, like that's a pretty big win. Because a big part of gentrification too is like, you know, communities falling apart and people not talking to their neighbors and not having these connections. We absolutely need that. If we have that, that's a win to me.
And then to just go back to kind of radical change, would you say, I guess, as you noted, because the situation is changing so quickly, would you say maybe in numbers people need to start showing up to city councils and just applying pressure in such a way that the city can't ignore it because it's a couple of people, but maybe it's such a large group there all at once?
Yeah, I think showing up to city council is definitely worth it. I think there is power in number. I don't think it's going to be the solution because we have had huge movements. We have these things in place, like people are working hard on the ground to make sure we're heard. But I still think it's important to show up to city council meetings to push for bylaws because often we see this all the time. Municipal governments will just scapegoat, be like, oh, this is a provincial matter. We can't do this because the province, and oftentimes this can be true, but oftentimes it's not true. There is a lot more that they can do in a lot of cases concerning bylaws. Like, for example, there are other boroughs that have pretty strong bylaws having to do with subdivisions and enlargements, which is a way that people are rent evicted. So in Verdun, we don't have that. And the bylaw that exists is like substantially watered down, making it not strong. This is something on a municipal level that could have been done, as a preventative measure, and that we're still very much hoping to see. So, if people want to show up at City Hall and talk about these things, this is absolutely, absolutely important for sure.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Is there any last things you want to share, maybe in general, but specific to having people getting more engaged in order to just stop gentrification in Montreal overall?
Yeah, for sure. I think to really have an impact on stopping gentrification in Montreal, we need to join our housing committees. We're really unique in the sense that in Quebec, we have these housing committees. They're strong structures that already exist. We need to really take advantage of that. Join your housing committee, for sure.
Thank you so much for your time, Lynn. It's been such a pleasure.